Okay.
Okay.
So I wanted to make some preliminary comments for those of you who don't have a copy. I brought copies last week. If you would like a copy, let me know. I will order some proof copies for you. The only thing I ask in return is that you would read some of it at least and leave me a review on Amazon. You can go to Amazon, search for the book, and it'll say something like unverified purchase or something if you haven't bought it. But those are very helpful. It's very hard to get reviews. So this is basically my dissertation at Sephardic College. So I put a lot of work into this. And as many of you know, I have quite a few books that I've worked on recently. So again, if you would like to contact me, let me know and I'll order.
You guys have to be quiet, okay? Do you want to go outside or
I don't know how to hide that thing. It's not that much in the way.
Sorry. Go ahead and start. Oh.
So the kids.
I do have another copy. I got this sort of preliminary production copy of Messianic Expectations. It has errors in it. Some of the Hebrew was transposed, which is often happens, and I have to correct it. But if someone would like this, if you'll read it and give me a review, it's the first person who raises their hand. All right. Good man. So again, there are errors in it, so I'm already aware of them. So.
Yeah, good. Good.
So as always, let me start off by thanking all of you for giving me the opportunity to share some of the vast knowledge that was beaten into me mercilessly at the Sephardic College of Jewish Studies in Chicago. I hope that my suffering will prove to be of enjoyment, educational, and hopefully interesting to you. So what we are going to do is we're going to cover a vast amount of history and other topics such as halakha and Jewish and Christian reactions towards some of the historical events that transpired. But we'll do so over a period of weeks because there's so much information that we really need to sort of break it down to digestible amounts. So the first thing that I would like to do is start off with basic definitions. One of the challenges or one of the tendencies that has happened within the American Jewish community is that anything that is not Ashkenazic has often been placed under the umbrella of Sephardic Judaism. That is obviously simplistic, it's erroneous. Sometimes I've wondered if it comes out of an apathy by the dominant Jewish community to sort of understand the nuances of different elements of the Jewish community. But we live in the 21st century where diversity is something that is promoted. So we live in some sense at the perfect time in history to appreciate the differences and the history of different groups within the Jewish community. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to define the term Sephardic, very basic. The term Sephardic, of course, is derived from the word Sepharad. And we would define that as and this is important, the medieval Jewish term that is used to identify present-day Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. Why do I say medieval? Now, I know that many of you would automatically quote Obadiah 1:20, where it talks about the exiles who are in Sepharad. But the reality is that we do not know definitively that that reference was specifically to present-day Spain and Portugal. It's not until the medieval period where we have specific references by Jews in Spain who apply that particular passage to themselves. For example, there was a very famous Jew by the name of Hazai ibn Shaprut in the 10th century who served in the court of Abed Rahman III, a Muslim caliph and leader of the Umayyad dynasty at that time what we would call today. And he wrote a letter to a group of Jews in a faraway land called Khazaria, or the Khazars, as you may have heard of them. and he writes a letter as an ambassador to them, and he references the Jews that are in the exile of Sepharad. So this is one of the first references that we have to Sepharad, referring to present-day Spain and Portugal. The Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, referred to himself as Sephardic, as a Spanish Jew. Even though he only spent about 12 to 13 years of his life in Spain itself. He was forced to flee by one of the events that we'll come across in future lectures, or maybe today, I'm not sure. And so he still valued this identification with Spain. And there are many other references. Just as a point of reference, the word Ashkenaz, of course, is used as a medieval Jewish term to signify Germany, or what we would call Germany today, really the Rhineland, which is Western Germany. And that term, of course, was expanded and applied to many other Jewish communities throughout Europe over time. So the next thing that we need to do, how do I go to the next? Spacebar. Is go to the 4 categories of ethno-cultural groups within the Jewish community that are legitimate members or should legitimately be represented as Sephardic Jews. Now, there's often a tendency to describe or ascribe the term Sephardic to many other Jews because of similarities that they share with Sephardic Jews. For example, you've heard the term Mizrahi, or you've heard the term Edot or Edut Mizrach, which are the communities of the East. For example, like Iraqi Jews. Iraqi Jews are often called, even they themselves will often use the term Sephardic. That's actually a misnomer, but the reason that they do that is because they actually share a lot in common with what we would call historically accurate Sephardic Jews. So the first thing I wanted to do is talk about the four groups, and then talk a little bit about the reasons that we include them, and then we'll start getting into a little bit of the history, because there's so many directions this can go off in. I mean, it's really expansive, and I think it's fascinating. So the first group is what we would call Spanish or Portuguese Jews. The second is Jews who are Judeo-Spanish, and then the third is Moroccan, and the fourth is Syrian. Moroccans are the largest group numerically. I think the last time that I had read about a demographic breakdown of Jews in the land of Israel, there were something like 600,000 Moroccan Jews. I think the next group, which is numerically the most significant, would be Syrian Jews. I think within the United States, there's a very large contingent. Maybe I might not be remembering correctly, but I think as many as maybe 70,000 Syrian Jews in the U.S. So that may have been throughout North and South America, but there's a lot of representation by Syrian Jews. And then the smallest contingent is actually Spanish Portuguese Jews, depending on how we define that term. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about. And then Judeo-Spanish Jews are Jews that we'll talk about a little bit more deeply as well. So what do we mean when we talk about the term Spanish-Portuguese? Well, of course, as we mentioned, historically, this refers to Sephardic, or Sepharad refers to the Iberian Peninsula. And why do I use the term Iberia? Well, the Greeks would refer to present-day Spain and Portugal as Iberia, and the Romans referred to it as Iberia with an H. But there were two other names that the Romans used, just as additional information. The Romans, when they conquered the peninsula, referred to the Spanish portion, if you will, if you were looking at a present-day map, the Spanish side as Hispania. This is where we derive the term Hispanic from. They referred to the western portion of the peninsula as Lusitania, or Lusitania. So they referred to it as Lusitania and Hispania. They also had other provinces like Galicia, which is still part of modern-day Spain in the western, northwestern corner. So those are just some additional terms. So when we talk about Spanish-Portuguese Jews, what are we referring to? And this is where we have to delve into a little bit of history, even though that's really not my focus at this stage. So the Jewish community had existed in Spain for at least 1,000 years by the time that they were expelled in 1492. A century before, however, in 1391, there was a catastrophic event which affected about 70 to 80 Jewish communities throughout the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon. Those were the two primary kingdoms. There was also the Kingdom of Portugal. There was a smaller kingdom in the north called Navarre, and we'll look at a map in a second. And in the south, there was the Kingdom of Granada, which was the last Muslim stronghold. And of course, we'll talk about how did the Muslims get there, how did the Visigoths get there, how did the Romans, all these different groups. But we're sort of skipping that to give you some context for this. So in 1391, there were attacks against about 70 to 80 Jewish communities throughout the peninsula in the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon. And this was catastrophic. Most scholars believe that maybe up to a third of the Jewish community was killed. Another third, roughly, was forced to convert or converted out of duress, out of fear. And then the last third was the only third that survived as what we would call unbaptized Jews. So they were not touched by the violence, or they survived. So you have three basic contingents: the group that died, the group that converted, and then the group that survived intact. So for the next 100 years, from 1391 to 1492, there is a social, religious, political, and economic crisis that affects the Kingdom of Castile. Why is that? Well, for such a long time, the primary minorities within the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon had been Jews and Muslims. And of course, Christians were the dominant group. But now there was another minority. It was these Jews who had technically become Christians. They were referred to in Spanish as conversos, as converted ones. And in the Jewish community, there were various names that were used. Oftentimes, the term was anusim. They were forced ones, individuals who were compelled to convert. So the problem was that these individuals who had converted formed a problem for Christian society. Because technically, they were now Christian, which meant that the barriers they had to socialization and economic opportunity were removed. They could sort of walk through the door and they could participate in Christian life, if you will, which meant new doors of opportunity. The problem was that they still had connections to their family. They lived in the same neighborhoods, they often ate the same food, they were related to all these Jewish families. They spoke the same way, if you will. They looked the same. And so this presented a problem because before it was, we could say, easily identifiable, to point out a Jew. You could point out a Jew, this is the community that they belong to, but now you have this new community that is sort of in between. They are technically Christian, but they still have these bonds of family, and in many cases, they still have the bonds of religion. Why? Because the conversions themselves have not been sincere. And many times, as we'll learn, these conversos were not educated in the catechism of the Catholic Church. They were often left to their own devices. So naturally, many of them continued to associate with their families. Some of them would frequent synagogues, and some of them would retain their Jewish identity as much as they could, as much as they felt comfortable with living in the midst of a Catholic or Christian society. So what happened within the dominant Christian society is that people began to become frustrated and angry because these conversos were now taking advantage of the economic and social opportunities that were now open to them. But many of the Christians said, we know they only converted because we made them, and they're not sincere, but now they're prospering and they're taking advantage, they're doing very well, and now these Jews are now infiltrating old Christian society. So this presented this sort of psychological, spiritual problem. And what would happen is when these conversos were continuing to Judaize, it convinced old Christians that this was a plot that was being unfolded by Jews. The plot was to infiltrate Christianity, to twist it, and to put it with blasphemy and heresy. So for a very long period of time in the 1400s and the 15th centuries, there were riots, there were attacks, there were turmoil within Castilian society in particular, who began to say, we're not so sure, we're so happy about the fact that all of these Jews converted. Maybe a generation ago we thought it was a miracle, it's the end of the age, the biblical prophecies are being fulfilled. Now there was a second guessing of that. And people started to call for distinction between those Jews who had converted and those Jews who had not. And so what began to be implemented was something called the limpieza de sangre, which was the purity of blood laws. Old Christians wanted to know that certain positions in government and in the church would be limited to individuals who were of pure blood. And this actually forms the basis for something which happens 500 years later, which is the Nazi conception of the purity of blood. And so it's very eerie to think that people were already thinking in this racial sense. So purity of blood laws began to be implemented. There was violence. We'll talk about that. Eventually, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella decided that the only way to deal with this would be to implement an inquisition. And what the Inquisition would do, from their perspective, was to really help conversos. You know, anytime anybody tells you they're there to help, it's often you should be worried. So from the perspective of the monarchs, what they wanted to do is they wanted to purify the converso problem. They wanted to separate the troublemakers. And the way they would do that, of course, is they were going to ferret out anybody who was continuing to practice Judaism on any level. And so the history of the Inquisition will be something else we'll cover. Eventually, after about 10 years, the monarchs feel that doesn't work. It's not really producing the results. Yes, we've killed thousands of conversos. Yes, we've taken control of their property. Yes, we've had thousands of indictments. But we just don't feel that this is really working out the way that we want it to. These conversos are continuing to practice, secretly. They're continuing to have these relationships with their families. How are we going to solve this? So ultimately, what Ferdinand and Isabella say is we need a final solution. And what is the final solution? Final solution, we have a final solution. In their perspective, it's not to kill them. It's to give them the last choice. But it's a choice that, as we will see, has been brought about in history before. And this is I don't know if the word is irony, but it's amazing because Iberian Jewish history is characterized by these forced conversions and by these choices of exile or conversion. So they say, well, we're gonna issue an edict in 1492, and we're gonna give Jews a final choice. And the final choice will be they will either convert or they will leave. Now, from the perspective of the monarchs, they actually wanted Jews to stay. They wanted them to convert. They wanted them to embrace the truth. So they wanted them to stay and convert, and then everybody would be happy. And I guess maybe from their perspective, the Messianic kingdom would, be initiated or something like that. And about 50,000 Jews, according to most scholars, did convert. But the rest don't. And then those Jews who decide that, well, we're not going to convert, they leave Spain, and the first place that they go, or at least the majority of them, is into Portugal. So this is where we start to get this Spanish-Portuguese connection. Now, there were already Jews in Portugal, small contingent, maybe about 20,000. Scholars say that maybe between 80 to 100,000 Spanish Jews, they move into Portugal. And the king of Portugal is like, hey, come over. I like Jews. We've always protected you guys. You guys are good for the economy. Come and stay. So Jews are there for about 5 years. And because of a marriage arrangement that he makes with Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, he decides that he is going to implement the same strategy. He is going to give the Jews an option of conversion or exile. But he doesn't want them to leave. So what he's thinking is, I'm going to convert them all by force, and then that way they have to stay. Now, the way that he does that, you have to give diabolical people credit for their diabolicalness. What he says is, you guys can leave, but the children have to stay. Or we take the children and we'll baptize them, and now you don't have a legal right to them. Of course, there's violence. People are literally dragged to the baptismal font. It's a terrible scene. It's just terrible. So the majority of Jews, Spanish Jews who went into Portugal, are now subjected to this conversion process. In Portugal, they would use the term new Christian. That's what they preferred. I mean, that term was also used on the Spanish side, but they like the term Novo Cristiano Novos, I think is the way that the Portuguese pronounce it. So now we have this sort of dual identity. Now, over a long period of time, as we will see, many of these individuals who went to Portugal eventually get to leave over a long period of time. And many of these Jews are the Jews who settle, these Christians, if you will, these conversos, or these new Christians, whatever you want to call them, they eventually traveled to places like Hamburg and places like Amsterdam, places, eventually London, the Caribbean, Brazil, all these places, and eventually into the New World. And the reason that we call them Spanish Portuguese is because they have this melded identity. They often spoke both languages, but they were generally these individuals who were former converts and were returning to Judaism much later on. We're talking about 100 years, 150 years, 200 years on. Now, the other group that I would include, that I would argue for, are the present-day descendants of Anusim, who we usually talk about crypto-Jews or secret Jews. The only difference really is that we're just talking about a gap of time. We're not talking about them returning in the 16th century or the 17th or even in the 18th. We're talking about people that are returning in the 20th and 21st century. But the lineage really, I think, is obviously connected here. Now, the second group, what we call the Judeo-Spanish Jews, are often also classified as Turkish Jews. Now, at the time, in 1492, the Ottoman Empire, if many of you may know, sort of the core of that was in Turkey, but they really controlled the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually they conquered into parts of Eastern Europe, to Bosnia, Herzegovina, Greece, Bulgaria, parts of Romania. I think even parts of, they made an attempt into as far as Vienna, into Austria, but it was a very expansive empire. When the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire said that Ferdinand and Isabella want to force Jews out, he's like, hey, you guys come over here. We will welcome you with open arms. You have freedom of worship. Their loss will be our gain. And so some Jews are able to go eastward, and some of them make it into the Ottoman Empire. So many of them settled in Istanbul, which used to be Constantinople. Many of them settle in Salonika, Thessalonica or Thessaloniki, the island of Rhodes. Some of them settle in modern-day Bulgaria. Anywhere in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, many of them actually settle in the present-day land of Israel. Many of them make it into Tiberias, near the Galilee. So they're scattered throughout, and some of them eventually make it into the area where there are already Syrian Jews. So they're scattered throughout in a diaspora in the Ottoman Empire, and usually they're treated very well. Now, we use the term Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-Espanol because these individuals took with them this language that, most people call it Ladino today, but most Jews in the East refer to it as Judeo or Espanol, or some version of those terms. And it's essentially, it was Castilian or Aragonese Spanish, if you will, but it was sort of frozen in time because they left at the end of the 15th century. And over a period of time, there are other languages that are added to it, Turkish, Arabic, and so forth. But these communities preserve that identity. So even until the 20th century, right before the Second World War, in Salonika, in Greece, there were still 80,000 Spanish-speaking Jews, if you will, Jews that spoke Judeo-Spanish and identified as descendants of the original exiles who lived in Salonika. There were Jews in Istanbul and so forth, and they still identified as Spanish Jews. There was a movie many years ago with, I think it was Tom Hanks. I don't remember the name of the movie, but it was about World War II, and there was an American pilot in Jerusalem for some reason. I think he was like a liaison to the British embassy or something like that, and he meets a young lady, and he hears her speaking Spanish or what he thinks is Spanish, to her sister, and he says, "Oh, is that Spanish?" And she says, "Yes." And he says, "Well, how long is it, since you moved from Spain?" And she says, 500 years. And the whole story about this love story that happens between them, but it's just sort of fascinating because it was the case. This identity was very well preserved. Just for information's sake, in Seattle, for example, there is a very well-known synagogue that follows the Judeo-Spanish tradition. And some of the liturgy that you've heard me do is actually from that tradition. Now, these Jews we're going to talk about more in a second because they impact directly American Jewish history. So we'll go back to that in a second. Moroccan Jews are included for various reasons. From 1391 onward, when people began to flee, Morocco is, of course, right across, the river, if you will, from Spain or the Iberian Peninsula. So some Spanish Jews begin to arrive in Morocco. And I think you could say educationally, financially, many of these Jews were of a higher echelon. They were better trained, they were more halachically trained. There were great rabbis among them. So sometimes when they would travel to North Africa, they would actually be appointed as the leaders of the community. Sometimes there was tension because sometimes the Spanish Jews tended to be a little bit prideful, because the peasants, that kind of thing. But, the Moroccan community essentially absorbed them, and some Spanish Jews maintained a form of Spanish called Haketia, which is more influenced by Arabic. So they had the equivalent, I guess you could say, of the Ladino or Judaismo in the East. And the other thing that Morocco has always had this very close tie to Spain geographically. The other reason that they are included under Sephardic Jews is because, of course, the Rambam lived there for a while. And they always had an affinity for the Mishneh Torah, and then, of course, the Shulchan Aruch. So their customs and their, the environment, the influence of Islam on both communities was very strong. And so the natural affinity between these communities were very natural. And so Moroccan Jews themselves identify as Sephardic Jews. And then the last group is Syrian Jews. Now, there were already indigenous Syrian Jews living in Syria, and sometimes Lebanese Jews are a subcult, it's like a subsect of Syrian Jews. But the same thing happened here. There were exiles from, the Judeo-Spanish side that traveled into Syria, and they became part of the Syrian community. And again, there were already Jews there, but because of the influence of Spanish Jews, because of the affinity of Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and things of that nature, these communities, in essence, were absorbed or became identified as Sephardic Jews. So those are the four categories. Do we have any questions regarding this? No. So as I mentioned, Iraqi Jews, sometimes even Yemenite Jews, other Jews are often identified as Sephardic, but the commonality is because of the affinity to Rambam, because of the Mishneh Torah. And then the Yemenites aside, the other affinity is because of the Shulchan Aruch. And Rabbi Joseph Caro, as you may know, was actually, if I remember correctly, a Spanish exile. So the influence of Spanish rabbis into the 1500s and into the 1600s was very significant. And many of you know, of course, the Kabbalistic circles that settled in Safat, Rabbi Joseph Caro, Shimon Al-Kabetz, Moses Cordovero, Rabbi Moses Cordovero, all those guys, Lechadodi, all the things that we sort of think about today, those were the products of, for the most part, Spanish descendants. So they had a tremendous amount of influence in that area. All right, so we've given you sort of, we talked about that a little bit. All right. So one of the questions I raise at the bottom is, why is the history of Spanish and Portuguese Jews important for American Jews? Now, it depends on the audience that I'm speaking with. But the reason for this is fascinating. The first Jews that arrived in the continental United States were Spanish and Portuguese Jews. This is Congregation Shereth Israel in New York. I had the privilege of being there. The congregation, and I'll show you some other pictures. This is the Ark. This is what B'nai Abraham will look like eventually, right? So they have a choir up here, which is very unique, very beautiful, and then the women's gallery is up on the second floor. The Jews, this congregation was established in 1654. It is the oldest continuous congregation in the United States, and it was founded by 23 conversos who were from Brazil, but originally from the converso diaspora, from Netherlands and different places. So these guys were all over the place. They were mercantilists, they were traders, and so forth. And so they eventually made it into New York when New York was a Dutch colony. Now, there was some antagonism there because Jews had already lived in Amsterdam, but there was some issue about whether they would be allowed to settle or not. This building is not from 1654, it's from the 1800s, but you can see sort of the magnificence of this beautiful community. This is another shot, a little different there. See the women's gallery. It's beautiful, it's just incredible.
No imagination if you open that cabinet right there. Let's just-
I think I counted something like 15 Torah scrolls in there. So now this is the little chapel. So they have like for Friday night, mincha, that kind of thing. They have this little chapel. I don't remember. I think it's a different one. I'll show you this in a second. And this is, I was able to daven there. I was very moving. And these are some of the plates. They talk about some of the founders. There were Lopez and Rodriguez and all these guys are like, where do they,
Is it still Sephardic synagogue?
It follows the Spanish Portuguese, the Siddur, the blue one that I use sometimes. That is they follow the rite, even though there are only like 3 families that are still traced to the original founders. So the majority of this is the irony, or the odd thing, is that the majority of the congregants of Shearith Israel, I think they have something like 400 or 500 families, are Ashkenazic. But they fell in love with the rite, because that rite has remained unchanged. And so whenever a rabbi comes, it was interesting. I met one of the rabbis years ago, about 18 years ago. He was from a Judeo-Spanish background. So he was from the Turkish Jewish side, and he had to learn the Spanish rite because his rite, was different. And in fact, when you've heard me do Psalm 146 through 150 or En Keloheinu, those are the Turkish style. And then most of the morning blessings are the Spanish Portuguese style. So it gives you sort of a contrast. So these are some of the plaques from the beginning. The second one, there are a total of 4. This is Congregation Yeshuat Israel in Newport, Rhode Island. I've had the privilege of being there as well. There's actually a seat, I think it's on this side, where George Washington came and sat. It's incredible. This is from the Revolutionary period. I think this was built like in the 1730s. It's something like that. I don't know exactly. But it was a historic site. It's a very small building, but you can tell the colonial architecture. And it still exists today. They usually call it the Turo Synagogue because there was a very famous member who was very influential. But it's just incredible. I mean, it's like you're going back in time into the 1700s. And George Washington, after he became president, he wrote them a beautiful letter. I didn't print it out, but they sent him a congratulatory letter. He had been elected president. And most Spanish Jews were very patriotic. They supported the revolutionary movement. And he sent them this moving letter. And he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, may the seed of Abraham find peace and prosperity in this land, so that every individual may sit under their own fig tree in tranquility and peace. It was just beautiful. And when I read it, it's like you get a little, because you have to think about how revolutionary this is. Jews have not been equal citizens in any other context. They may have achieved rights and success in different European society, even in Muslim society, but the reality is this is like the first time where there are equal citizens. And it's just a new era for Jewry in general, but Spanish Jews are in the midst of that. And this is the balcony. Actually, this is not the balcony, but this is where the bima is. So you can see that. Now, this is obviously another building. This is Mikveh Yisrael in Savannah, Georgia. This is obviously a much later building, but there were Jews in the south. This is Mikveh Yisrael in Philadelphia. They also follow, all these are Spanish Portuguese. This one still follows the Spanish Portuguese tradition. And I think they use that blue Siddur. And then this is Beth Elohim. Now today, this is it's Beth El. It's a Reformed temple. So this was founded in 1765 by Spanish, and I think there were some German Jews as well. They were pioneering in many ways. They were pioneering because they were one of the first congregations, or the only congregation in South Carolina, but then they were also pioneering because they became the first Reformed temple in the United States. So they were sort of ahead of their time, I guess. not necessarily for good, but that's a matter of opinion. So, yeah.
How did these congregations survive in the 1950s and 60s, things like that, when there was all this turmoil in the South?
Well, the odd thing is that there were many Jews in the South during the Confederate War, or the Civil War, and to be quite honest, many of them were plantation owners and had slaves. In fact, if I remember correctly, the Secretary of War for the Confederate States of America was Jewish. I don't remember his name, but you can look that up and you'll be surprised. There's a funny story I always like to tell. It was during the Civil War, and it was in the South. The Northern armies the Union armies had invaded, and it was during Passover. And I guess there was a Jewish guy in the Northern Army, and he knew that the family was baking matzah. And so a little Jewish boy who was a Southern boy came out, and the Union soldier said, Chag Sameach. And then the boy looked at him, and he ran in the house, Mama, Mama, it's a dirty Yankee Jew. It's a dirty Yankee Jew. And the family invites him in to have Pesach with them and Seder. But, it's brother against brother. I mean, this particular case, they could find, some commonality, but Jews were on all sides.
It's
So,
like, remind me of the Ukraine-Russia thing.
yeah. So,
Rabbis are divided 50-50 on whether they should go with Putin or not.
yeah, exactly. Very, very complicated. And I think it is somewhat odd that they were accepted. But, in Houston, even into if I remember correctly, in the 50s, there was one temple that argued against the abolishment of segregation. So there were truly Jews. The vision of American Jewry is that it's very liberal, which it is. About 70% of American Jews are very liberal. And there were individuals like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I've talked about quite a bit, who was the teacher of my rabbi, and he marched, with the civil rights movement, and there are pictures of him, hand in hand with Martin Luther King and so forth. But that's not, there were other individuals who were not so, in agreement with that perspective. So what I did here was just note some famous Spanish Portuguese Jews. I have my son Ellie right there, just for future reference. This is Isaac Ababranel, Don Isaac Ababranel, I'm sure you've heard of. There's supposed to be Joseph Caro at the top. Most of you have heard that, what is her name, Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor. They say that she's the first Hispanic on the Supreme Court. Well, actually that's not true. Because if you look at the corner, that is Benjamin Cardozo. And Benjamin Cardozo was a member of the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community. Now, they classified him as Portuguese. So they said, well, that's not really Hispanic, but it's a misnomer. So, Benjamin Cardozo was appointed, I think, by Woodrow Wilson, if I remember correctly. So that was like in 1915 or something like that. But nobody will ever acknowledge that. You have Emma Lazarus, who is famous because of her poem on the Statue of Liberty, Give us your tired and your poor. You have Manasseh ben Israel, who was a famous rabbi in Amsterdam. He actually was arrested by the Portuguese Inquisition. I forgot his name. He's in the book. He has his Portuguese name, and he was like a very what do you call it, a polymath. He was a printer, and he did a lot of stuff to survive. He was a rabbi. I think he traveled to the New World and was a rabbi in Brazil for a while. And he was very much involved with Christians, about educating them. You have to think about it. This is in the 50s, 1660s, and he's educating individuals who are involved with the Protestant, not the Protestant Reformation, but the English Civil Wars. So with Puritans like Oliver Cromwell. Because of him, Jews were allowed to enter back officially into England in the 1660s. So he knew that, in fact, he did something very interesting. He argued to Oliver Cromwell and to the Puritans who had won against King Charles I, who was Anglican. He said that, Christians believed that the Messianic age would come about when there were Jews in every part of the world in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So he said, the one place that there are not openly practicing Jews is England. And so he actually, Oliver Cromwell brought the idea, and he said, we're going to lift the banishment of Jews that had been in effect since 1290. Now, there were already Spanish and Portuguese conversos living in London at the time. Many of them were physicians, many of them were, mercantilists and so forth, but they were not officially, out of the closet, so to speak. So that was something important that Manasseh ben Israel did. Of course, you have the Rambam down in the corner. And then some of these other guys I have to look up again. This is Spinoza here.
This guy up in the corner.
Which one?
I've seen him before.
This guy in the corner?
Yeah.
I think he was a famous boxer in England. He was a Spanish,
British.
yeah, he was a Spanish-Portuguese boxer. I think this is Moises Segias, I think. One of the first rabbis, I think, in Spanish, Sephardic rabbis. And I forgot, this guy here, I think, is also a British rabbi. I think one of the first rabbis in London. Because the first synagogues in London, in England, were Spanish-Portuguese synagogues. So there's a famous synagogue that's called the Bevis Mark Synagogue. And to this day, they follow the Spanish-Portuguese tradition. Very ornate, very choirs and so forth. And I think this guy is either Michel de Montaigne or Francisco Sanchez. A lot of these guys are philosophers and so forth. But just gives you, Spanish and Portuguese Jews have had a lot of impact on history over the time. So what, do we know what time it is? 5:09. Did we start at 4 or no? Okay, so maybe another 20 minutes or something like that. Okay. All right, so let's go back now. So we give you sort of this broad overview. Let's go back and sort of look at some of the history. So the earliest archaeological evidence that we have that testifies to the existence of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula is actually rather late. It's actually from about the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. So we're talking about the 200s, 300s of the Roman period. So 200-300 years after AD, if you will, or CE, Common Era. So this is rather late, and what they found is they have found tombstones. So we know definitively that the people that were there were Jewish. Now, what's interesting is that the other proof that we have for the early existence of Jews is actually Christian sources. And this is something that Art had talked about. It's in the book in the first chapter. There was something called the Council of Elvira, a town called Elvira. And it was a collection of priests and presbyters and bishops that had gathered in to discuss issues that were pertinent to early Christianity. Of course, this is the early 300s. Christianity has been expanding considerably, but it's still in its very early stages if you think about it. So one of the things that these individuals did is they said, well, there are certain things that Christians should and should not do. And several of those points are specifically related to Jews. So the first thing they said is, you're not allowed to live with them and you're not allowed to eat with them. The second thing is they said, you're not allowed to have your daughter marry them. And then the last thing they said is, you're not allowed to go to the Jews and ask them to bless your fields. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that the social interaction between Jews and non-Jews was very close. If you have to tell people not to eat with them, then obviously they're eating with them all the time. And if you're telling them don't marry them, well, obviously it's not an issue. Now, we don't know if the halachic perspective of these Jews was such that they didn't care that the woman wasn't Jewish, or I think it's more likely that what would happen is when the woman married a Jew, they adopted the faith of the husband. And so from the church's perspective, the concern is they're losing a member of the church to Jewry or to Judaism. And then, of course, what's intriguing at the very last prohibition is the fact that Christians still had positive views of Jews as having some kind of claim and contact and relationship with God. Why? Because they're going to them to bless their fields. Now, one of the things I have studied is Christian anti-Judaism and frankly, Christian anti-Semitism. It's something that existed very early on. You can see it within certain church fathers, even from the beginning of Ignatius, for example, I would argue, who's from basically, I think he died like in 117, so you're only talking about a couple of generations after the apostles. He's very anti-Jewish. And if you look at other church fathers, from the very beginning, the issue of supersessionism, anti-Judaism, and in the 4th century, in the 300s, someone like John Chrysostom, they have a big problem because their claim is that they have replaced Israel, right? They have replaced the Jewish people. The problem is that these Jews won't go away. So the physical existence of Jews who claim this eternal covenant undermines the validity of what they're claiming. And yet, even while there is this stream of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, there's still this other side where there's a respect and a knowledge that there's a physical connection, the spiritual link that they don't necessarily how to wrestle with. It's interesting that it's not related, but I was reading about this this week, that even individuals like Jerome and Augustine, who are very famous church fathers, when they were determining or where they would argue for a particular book to be included in the canon of their scripture, they would often make reference to the fact that, well, the Jews don't include that in their book, in their Bible, so that was a basis for them to say, maybe we should also follow that particular perspective. The discussion was specifically about the book of Enoch. But it was interesting because, Jerome studied with rabbis, or he claims that he studied with Jews. Augustine's views are very complicated, and they actually form the basis of the way that Christians will respond to Jews in the medieval period. He believed that Jews had been preserved as a people to testify to the legitimacy of the gospel. So his view is you should keep them alive to serve as its living witness, but only to the extent that you shouldn't let them prosper, so to speak, but they should be kept there in perpetuity to testify to how right we are. So the fact that you have Christians going to Jews, it's confusing because the reality is that the lines are never fully drawn. The theologians and the rabbis sometimes present very hardline views, but the reality on the ground is much different. It's very porous, and neighbors and individual families will have this different relationship.
Even in church leadership, we're often, we like to lump the Catholic Church in with the government, civil powers, because they were married. But quite often, in the record, popes tried to protect Jews with the civil authorities for after them.
Yes.
And that's often neglected because it's easier to just throw the entire Catholic Church off to the side than the hyperbole of it.
Yes.
But there's actually a lot of popes that, in the records, that are fighting the civil authorities and trying to keep the civilian anti-Semitic violence at bay. So even in the leadership, there's a knee-jerk wanting to keep that relationship, but having to fight the political tensions.
Very true.
It's always gray.
Very true.
It's never black and white.
One of the things I note here at the bottom is that in 315, there's already starting to be under Constantine, there are the first limitations of pagans and Jews in the Roman Empire. Now, the Jewish position in the Roman Empire for most of Jewish history was actually positive. There had been a relationship, I don't know if you know, but between Judah Maccabee and the Roman Republic. They had forged a treaty. The Romans, of course, looked at it from strategic perspective. They have the Seleucid Empire. The Romans are on the rise. And so there were good relations. They were considered friends of Rome. Even Herod the Great, I believe, if I remember correctly, assisted Julius Caesar when he was in Egypt. He was trapped. And Herod the Great came with Jewish soldiers and assisted him. And so Julius Caesar was forever grateful for that. And so Jews were allotted certain privileges within the Roman Republic and then later in the empire that we sometimes don't think about because we focus in on the Roman occupation of the land of Israel or Judea and Samaria. There's a couple of examples. Jews did not have to. I think they could choose different days for court, debates or something like that. If they have a lawsuit or something. They could choose an alternate date. There were also, if I remember correctly, the Romans had like a social welfare system where they would give out free bread, to keep the masses checked. And Jews could choose an allotment that was not on Saturday. So there were certain things. There were also issues that regarding, the Jews were allowed in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, to offer sacrifices on behalf of the emperor. And that was the way that they would show their fidelity instead of having to have Roman gods or, Roman legionary, I forgot what they call them, the banners and so forth, which themselves had pagan symbols. So there were ways that the Romans seemed to be able to accommodate Jewish sensitivities at times. Sometimes they would react against that. And of course, the rebellion in 66 through 73, the second rebellion in 115 to 117 under Trajan, and then the third rebellion under Bar Kokhba were, I wouldn't say aberrations, but they were limited periods of friction that existed that changed the Jewish status substantially, because the Romans began to see Judaism as really the heart of the problem. So they began to implement restrictions on circumcision and things of that nature. But as time passed, there would be sort of a reconsideration by the Roman emperors, and they would restore many privileges to the Jewish community. So under Constantine now, we start to see, of course, the very slow process of Christianization, and now pagans and Jews are beginning to pose a problem, I think, theologically for the church, and this relationship that becomes fused between the church and the government. So, the Roman Empire existed as a unified body until the end of the 4th century. So 395 is the key date where there was a division of the empire into the western half and the eastern half. The eastern half was what we call today the Byzantine Empire. They just call themselves the Romans. I mean, they still saw themselves 1,000 years later as Romans, the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire was much weaker. And what happened in the 4th century is that there were Germanic tribes that we call the Goths and the Visigoths, and they began to move westward because of other tribes like the Huns. And the Goths and the Visigoths came to the Romans and said, hey, can we settle within the empire? We don't mean any harm, but we would like your protection. And the Romans were like, okay, you guys can come in. What happened eventually is that the Romans mistreated the Goths and the Visigoths. And what happened is they rebelled. And the Roman Empire's strength was on the decline. They eventually traveled westward, and they sacked Rome in 410. And eventually the Romans made an accommodation with them. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to let you settle in France or Gaul and into Hispania. And you can have a quote-unquote independent kingdom, but you will be under the hegemony of the Roman Empire. So this relationship existed for quite some time. When the Visigoths went into Spain and into Gaul, they were Christians by that time, but they were Arian Christians. And their relationship with Jews seemed to have been sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say positive, but it was neutral. They didn't have any particular issue with Jews. What happens eventually is that the Visigoths wind up converting to Chalcedonian or Catholic Christianity as we know it. And for whatever reason, when they do that, their attitudes towards Jews changes. Now, I'm not sure if it's because of their conversion to this particular other form of Christianity, or if there's if there's a political issue involved or something else, but their attitude towards Jews becomes very different, and they start to take a very hardline position against them. So these are just some other maps of how the Visigothic kingdom spread out. So I think what I'll do is I'll try to end the discussion with this Visigothic era. So what we have is a series of events that happen. There's a series of councils, of church councils that take place in Toledo, which is the capital of the Visigothic kingdom. It's in the center of Spain. You can't see it. And what happens in these councils is they're still trying to formulate the nature of early Christian doctrine and thought and how that's going to be expressed. But there's always this component that has to do with Jews. And in 587, I mentioned here that this King Recared adopts Catholicism, so there's this transition. And what he does is and there's a lot of information in the book about this, the first thing he does is he starts to ban Jews from owning slaves, from intermarriage, and from holding positions of authority. Now, when Jews purchased slaves, if they were male, they would circumcise them. And if you know from studying the Mishnah, there are different categories of responsibility toward the commandments that individuals have. A slave has a certain obligation because they don't have complete control of their time. A woman has other obligations. There's like a hierarchy depending on the individual's free status and their position. So the concern of the Catholic Church was, if they have slaves, they will convert them. And then we will have this increasing Jewish problem. So Rocaerd is the first one who does that. Now, in 610, under, it's spelled differently sometimes, but Sisput is the Visigothic king. He is the first king that really shifts the relationship in a very different direction. What he does is he not only has anti-Jewish edicts, but he gives them the choice of conversion or exile. So now we have the first incident. We talked in the very beginning of the class about 1492, but now we have the first incident where you either convert or you leave. And according to the Arab historian al-Ghazi, who's also mentioned in Secret Jews, there's a claim that up to 90,000 Jews converted to Christianity. Now, there's something else that we should note. If you remember, with the fall of the Western Empire, there was still the Eastern part, and there was an emperor by the name of Justinian. And under Justinian in the East, what he wanted to do is he wanted to recapture all the territories of the West. And he actually succeeds. He's very close in having achieved that. Very, very close. He takes over Italy. He takes over Corsica, Sardinia, North Africa. And I think it was actually before this. It was in the 550s. I think it's Athengild. There's one of the Visigothic kings. The Visigoths are characterized by a lot of political instability. Most of their kings don't last very long. They're like tribal chiefs, and that kind of there's a movie that reminds me of them. But in any case, there's always this infighting, and they don't last very long. So one of I think it's Athengild, says he contacts the Eastern Romans and says, "Hey, can you help me out? I have a dispute with one of the kings that want to take over." And so they help him, and what they do is the Byzantines, the Eastern Romans, support this Visigothic king, but they sort of help themselves to the bottom part, which is this area in the south is called is it Andalusia? In Arabic, it's El Andalus, which means the land of the Vandals. Now, if you remember your world history from high school or college, you'll remember that the Vandals were another group of barbarians who invaded. So the Goths, the Visigoths, you had the Suebi, and then you had the Vandals that apparently settled in the south and then eventually moved into North Africa. So it's interesting how history has a memory of that, and the Arabs themselves would call, well, that's the land of the Vandals, and that's where Al-Andalus and Andalusia came from. So why is this important? It's important because the Eastern Romans were very anti-Jewish. So even though they may have only controlled the southern parts of the peninsula, their influence on the Visigoths was probably the key factor that began to make them switch in a different direction, and to sort of understand that the Jews are subversive. They're the fifth column. There's something that we need to deal with theologically as well as economically and politically. And then what we notice is that there's a series of councils in Toledo, and they keep talking about this issue of Jews, and they start to talk about Jews who are relapsing into Judaism. It's like the conversions. You have Jews who have converted, but 20 years later, the councils will start talking about the fact that these guys are celebrating Passover, they're circumcising the children, they're keeping, dietary laws. And it's an issue that you see constantly within the councils. What that tells us is that the Visigoths did not have a very strong control of the country, because obviously if people are still doing this, they're not being stopped. And so their ability to control the country was limited. And the ability of the church to sort of keep an eye on people was also limited. And this continues on for really until the end of the 7th century. So again, there's some other things that happen, and they're detailed in the book. This is just to show you some of these key guys. Rocaerd, and then Sisput is the guy who ordered the conversion of Jews in Spain. And at that point, I think we'll go ahead and stop. So what happens is the Visigothic kingdom exists until 711. And at that point, we now have the Islamic invasion by Berbers and Arabs from North Africa. and we have a very different period of Jewish history, which is actually, for the most part, beneficial. And so then that will lead us into the next class. So if you would like to ask any questions or complaints or jokes, everybody's asleep.
So much of this book that you discovered.
We covered probably into the first chapter. I don't know the exact page number, but we went up to the brink of the Islamic period. So there's greater detail on the specific councils and the people that were involved and the Visigothic kings and some of those things.
So when these Spanish, Portuguese Jews or any other Sephardic Jews, when they were forced to move from place to place, did they hold on to their identities same way they had it at home, or did they kind of like they continue to assimilate? Did they assimilate to where they then moved to kind of like their system watered down, or did they hold strong?
Well, there were always individuals that would assimilate. There were Jews that left the peninsula and they would go to a region that was free. And some of them just said, I don't want to go back to Judaism. I'll just be a Protestant. I became Protestants. Or some of them actually left, became Jewish, and said, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm going to go back and be Catholic again. We have cases like that. In the case of those communities that became established, they would often absorb the cultural elements of the society in which they lived, but they proved to have the staying power for quite some time. I mean, there's a British, the Anglicization, I don't know the proper term, but when Spanish Jews went to Britain, they became British, but they still held on to the Spanish Portuguese customs. So their liturgy really was the key. That is what unified them to other groups throughout the world. This diaspora, if you go to New York, they're very American, but the liturgy, even though there's variation, there's still this continuity between them. And I think that I think is something that survived. In the East, where you would have these much larger groups of people, because we're talking in the West, they're very small, hundreds, thousands. In the East, you're talking about tens of thousands. You had a lot of variety. You would have, well, this is the Castilian synagogue, and well, this is the Portuguese synagogue. Well, this is the synagogue of the Aragonese. And so they're all, quote unquote, Spanish. I mean, they would probably object to that term, but they're all from the same area. But there's enough of them where they can have like little niches and so what happened over time as they reduced, then those niches sort of are reduced, and then they sort of meld into the larger group, right? And it's interesting because in the East there were so many Spanish that came in that the local Jews were sort of overtaken, and they were sort of, forced to comply.
So their customs kind of disappeared.
So there's Jews that are called Romanians. They were the ones who were there in the Roman Empire before. And I also failed to mention, there were in Italy, if you go to Naples, Venice, other places, there are Spanish Portuguese synagogues. They're very impressive. In fact, I sent out a video on the group that was one of the synagogues in Rome. They had a huge service. It's very impressive. And in the second, in one of the stories under the main section, they had a Spanish Portuguese service. But in the main service, they sang some of the liturgy of the Spanish and Portuguese tradition. So there's impacts that are still profound in different traditions.
In the book, you mentioned how Netanyahu's dad.
Yes, Ben Sion.
And he says basically that the descendants of these people who were forced out later on became, or that stayed, are actually Christian, and their children, grandchildren are truly Christian, but they're not Jews. They're married to that, or?
Well, that has been the great debate. So what Ark is talking about is, all of you know Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. His father, Ben Sion Netanyahu, was actually a scholar of the Inquisition. He wrote a book called The History of the Marranos back in the 1960s. And he wrote, I think it was the establishment of the Inquisition, this huge, 900-page book, wrote a lot of books on it. And he was very controversial. So his thesis was contrary to what most people had suggested before. What most people said is these Jews were forced to convert, and they they tried to maintain their Jewish connections as much as possible. Then the Inquisition was set up, and then, you know, we have millions of documents of the Inquisition. I mean, one thing about the Inquisitors is they were very good note takers and, you know, very methodical. I mean, and some of those records have been lost, but, you know, they were there and they're taking the notes on, and somebody's getting tortured, you know, he was screaming, and, you know, it's very detailed. And so his thought and others was like, oh, it's a fake. You know, the Inquisition was, you get tortured and you're going to say whatever it is that they want to say. And his argument was, after the first generation, people were sincere Christians. You know, they forgot they assimilated instantaneously, and the Inquisition was actually the one that was creating these conversos. Because what would happen, and in this sense, there's some truth to that, the Inquisition would put out a list of prohibited observances, and they would say, if you see, if there's not smoke, you know, on the chimney on Shabbat, you know, that person is not lighting a fire, so that means they're observing. You know, if they clean their house on this day, and they would have a list of all these, if they don't eat this, and they would create this list. So conversos often, if they were cut off from other Jews, they would actually go to the list and they would say, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. Yeah. Or if they went to seminary, think about it, they would read the Apocrypha. They would read, you know, Tobit, Judith, all these very Jewish books that, you know, the Catholics have in their canon. And they're like, oh, this is what a Jew is. So they would start this. It's like a weird, you know, how people use the term biblical Judaism. Well, in their eyes, it's like, well, this is what Judaism is, and this is what it, you know, this is how they would live that out. So I would say that happened in certain cases, but I think that he is too. We have a lot of responsa. We have a lot of situations where people are writing to rabbis in North Africa saying, we have this case, you know, we have this situation. You have cases of people leaving, and you have cases of people staying. Why? Because, you know, they have kids, they have parents and so forth. So I think sometimes this assumption that they could just sort of, you know, get out of Dodge is simplistic. Like, how many of us could so easily, I mean, your case, maybe, because, you know, but you live in the 20th century, right, 21st century. How easy was it to uproot your family?
Take a boat.
Yeah, with pirates, and I mean, there are pirates, there's disease, it's not so simple. So I think what happened is there is a natural attrition if you don't have constant education. But I think the fact that what one author said, I think it was either Chaim Beinart also mentioned, it's like you have to think about the Inquisitors. If their only reason to get is to get the wealth that these Jews possess, why would you go to this expansive documentation? It's like the Nazis. The Nazis were very, like, they write, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of records. Like, if you're that devious, why would you document everything that you do? And it's like, yes, there may be some cases in which somebody's accused of something and maybe there was another reason that they got caught. But it's just too much evidence, I think, that supports the fact that these people were keeping something. And maybe sometimes they didn't know. You know, maybe there have been cases where they don't know the reason for that observance, but they're still transmitting that in some form or fashion. And so my book is sort of, you know, I wouldn't say a response to Netanyahu, but against his position. And I think that part of his idea was he doesn't believe that the Catholic Church was targeting these individuals because they were Jewish in terms of observance. He believes they targeted them because they were Jewish ethnically, like they were anti-Semites. And so his belief, it's the question of, you know, before you were a Jew because you follow the Mosaic law. But then this change happens, and now you're a Jew because you have a dirty Jewish blood. You know, you have this connection, and no matter what you do, you're always going to be that. So he argues that it transfers from a religious to a racial issue. And so I think in part maybe it's, you know, Netanyahu grew up in the Second World War. I mean, so maybe there's a response to anti-Semitism that he understands in the modern world. And I think that he saw that, because he passed away a couple of years ago, he saw the Spanish as the forerunners of modern day anti-Semitism. So I think there's some truth in that, but I don't think the religious component can be eliminated.
So this is what leads to the father telling the oldest son soon before his death, Jews, how long you're oldest. I think I've heard this in many families.
Yes, and there's a case later on in the 1600s. There's a very famous case. There was a guy named Michel de Montaigne who was a French philosopher, and he himself had like a converso background, but he talked about being present at the deathbed of one of his friends, and his friend had last rites as a Catholic, so last unction or whatever it's referred to, and then after that, he's done with that. The friend who's about to die says, "Can you please call a rabbi?" And he calls a rabbi and he says, I want to die on the law of Moses. So he just had last rites, and then, and his, so you have these kinds of, last deathbed confessions, if you will. So you have a lot of that. Okay. So we'll stop there, and then we'll continue with the torture.